Okay, so today's presentation is a mix of a bunch of things, which is really like the path that I've been taking on in learning more about persimmons. We call the talk, Stewarding the Future of American Persimmons. But what I'm really going to talk about today, yes, stewarding, like the past, the present, and hopefully the future. But also, I'm going to give you an intro to persimmons. You know, why I think they're amazing, why we're breeding. We've chosen to breed them at the Savanna Institute, and then get into some differences in persimmons in the United States and some folklore, and then a little bit of fruit exploring. If many of you don't know, that's something that I also do, and I can't stop from doing is I fruit explore all across the United States and currently the world. Looking for talking to amazing horticulturalists and understanding their fruit culture and sharing in the germplasm that is around. So hopefully, one day improve all sorts of things in the fruit world and the nut world. All right, so let me see. Here we go. Okay, so at Savanna Institute, I'm part of the tree crop breeding program, where we have now 4 tree crop breeders. And then there's me, the germplasm specialist. One of the things that I do is I go out, I identify good germplasm for the breeding programs, and good people to talk to for the breeding programs, and bring everybody together. For this talk, I'm going to be talking about persimmon, which is one of our silvopasture species that we're working on in coordination and also in conjunction with black locust and mulberry. Mulberry is actually my most favorite fruit, but persimmon is up there as well. And also our tree crop breeding program is working on American elderberry, black currant, hazelnut, Chinese chestnut, and hopefully I've said all the other ones. I think so. Okay, but today for persimmon, I'm really into like sharing why we're working on persimmon. So I'm going to go ahead and launch into that. And for those that might not know, silvopasture is combining livestock with various tree species, either for fruit production, nut production, or shade. One of my specialties is identifying qualities in fruit and nut production for raising livestock. All right, so let's dive in. About the persimmon, it's a really high quality wood. It's in the ebony family, so that's like a darker wood. The other thing about ebony in the temperate portions of the world is that it's pretty slow growing. But that means usually slow growing, those wood rings are closer together, it's a much higher quality wood. There's tons of persimmon relatives around the world that produce fruit, tons. And some of the people we work with, like at the Missouri Botanical Garden, have worked specifically on persimmons in tropical areas, and they are wild to see. Much different from the khaki persimmon that most of us know most Americans, I think, at this point in time, when they think of persimmon, they think of the grocery store khaki persimmon that they might see. That actually comes from like China, Japan, Korea, that area, which is the most economically important. And that's partially because it's been developed and bred for like 1,000 years or more. And so, they've worked out a lot of the kinks, and that's why it's on the shelves today. But about the American persimmon, in case you don't know how to identify it, or you are ever in the woods and wondering what's that, the tree has this beautiful alligator bark, and when you get really close to it, you can see in between the big blocky bark, these fissures are often like a orange color, or like a tan orange color. The younger the bark, the more orange you'll see. There are some trees that are 80 feet tall, and those are often timber species, like, but well, they're not grown for timber hardly ever. But they sometimes are considered when foresters are doing timber cruises and such. But then there's the smaller trees that are 20 to 30 feet tall, and they might be more open grown, whereas the taller ones might be more, in a more competitive environment. And they're pretty much all over the place. There's persimmon. I live in Virginia, and so there's persimmons all over the Mid-Atlantic region, all over the Southeast, and then into the Midwest. There's quite a few persimmons as well. Indiana, it's like, you know, probably what they should be known for if they're not already officially. Illinois, into some parts of Iowa, southern Wisconsin, and all around there. All right. Also, the native fruits can vary in size quite widely. Usually it's between 3/4 of an inch and 2 inches, though, there's this old, there's this one tree variety called Kansas that I think I found it actually. It's ultimately not available anymore, but I'm pretty sure I've identified it recently, and that can get up to 3 inches in diameter. So we're talking like pretty large fruit for an up to pretty large fruit. They are astringent, and so that's a big difference from like khaki persimmon or the Asian persimmons, is that a lot of this astringency has been bred out of those. So you can just pick them off the tree and take a bite, and they won't make your mouth turn inside out and completely dry out and ruin your day. But with American persimmons, that is there when they're not ripe. When they're perfectly ripe, the tannins can go away. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you wonder, well, this seems ripe? When is it gonna be ripe? And these are one of the big questions of domestication and such that we're working on at Savanna Institute. And their reputation for these tannins, goes way back in the colonization era. This is I believe this is John Rolfe, who wrote, "It's not ripe, will drive a man's mouth awry with such torment, but when it is ripe, it's as delicious as an apricot." So with that, hold on. With that said, by the way, there's a lot of, I guess it's not hearsay, but anyway, there's a lot of talk about how persimmons you have to eat persimmons after fall, or sorry, after frost. And that's not necessarily true. Yes, some persimmons do seem to taste better after a frost, but I'll get into this a little bit more in that there are plenty that are ripe well before a frost in more southern environments or warmer environments, or even not. All right. As for nutrition, persimmons are amazing. They are, I think, after the date palm, which is not native to the US, the American persimmon is the most nutritionally dense fruit that grows. It's a super carbohydrate. They have 31% sugar, tons of vitamin C, especially vitamin C in the leaves, beta carotene, which is what gives it that orange color inside of the flesh, zinc, iron, and 19 amino acids, which almost makes it a complete protein. If it were to have that other one, it would be like in the most epic category of trees, in terms of what it could provide for humans and livestock. And yeah, the leaves are really high in vitamin C. Often, there are indigenous uses that I'll talk about in a minute. Some of them have been a persimmon leaf tea for vitamin C. Okay. Also, they're just exceptionally important, or have been important in the indigenous, in various indigenous groups. And this is a map of where persimmon seed has been found in old mound site excavations. So this just gives you an idea of how crazy the spread of persimmon, even into, these areas where, like, if you call around and, you ask people about persimmon, like up here, for example, they'll be like, oh, it's not native here, but certainly was there in the fossil record, and it's certainly there in some of the mound sites. And in a lot of these sites, it was the highest concentration of fruit found, which is, to me, that's amazing to me. But also, they were used for drinks, eaten fresh or dried. Actually, like I've read that persimmons that have a longer form rather than a more round form were selected for drying because they could be put on a line a lot easier, and their like surface area air contact was higher so that they would dry out for storage longer. And yeah, they would be turned into flours for bread, amongst many other things, like eating them deliciously fresh or dried. And this I'm from the East Coast. I'm from Virginia, so like a lot of the tribes in my area were well known to consume persimmon. But this also, spreads basically across the United States. And of interest, Bartram and DeSoto have both documented basically persimmon orchards that were being grown in the Atlantic seaboard. Bartram, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, but Bartram's words were basically describing a persimmon, basically a persimmon and honey locust savanna, where they were persimmon, by the way, is fire tolerant. It's a fire adapted species, so they were burning the understory of these areas, and they were just blown away by the fruit that was hanging on these trees. All right. In terms of silvopasture and why we're working on it, yes, they're an incredible carbohydrate, and this was not missed by farmers, where in the 1800s, early 1800s, all through probably until like the early, maybe early mid like 1900s, there were hog and chicken orchards that were planted, especially throughout the American South. But also recently, I read of people in Indiana cultivating persimmon, actually more of a sharecropping scenario, cultivating persimmon for hogs and chickens to eat, and how they preferred that to eating the actual persimmons themselves because it was a lot easier to do. And where they're planted traditionally, these orchards were planted like for instance, in North Carolina, Virginia, in that sort of southern corridor. There still are some relic orchards left, and these persimmons are co-planted with everbearing mulberries. And so the thought there was this everbearing mulberry will start bearing in April, May, and go through July, essentially into early August. And then that's when these various persimmons would take off and start bearing in August and into, sometimes into January or so. It just depends. And I'll get into that a little bit more too. And so this was a way to help feed your animals for nothing, is just by planting trees. And that's sort of where we're getting at these days with influencing what goes into silvopastures. And also, my own personal observation is that if you feed persimmons for 2 months, feed persimmons to pigs for 2 months, the fat does get a sort of yellowish or orangish tinge, and that's due to the beta carotene. This, however, has also been proven in various Japanese feed trials, where up to, I think it was 10% of khaki persimmon was also tinging the fat, so of hogs, which you might think like, an orangish tint, like that's not very great to look at. But if you spin that other way, this is a really great way to potentially market silvopasture fed meats, is, how to judge a pig by what they eat, and therefore their quality by just visual cues. That sort of thing makes me excited. All right. Also, like, wildlife love persimmon. And actually, like, a few years ago, I was actually paid to like research this for somebody. And so this is, so I have a lot of information on what eats persimmon these days. And so, you know, it's a great game bird food, by the way. So like if just FYI to those of you wanting to plant persimmons, or those of you with land, you can often get in under some payments that incentivize game bird payments. You can get in under those with persimmon for turkeys and bobwhite quail. There's plenty of information out there on these birds eating that, and they love them. A lot of songbirds eat them. And you know, when we think about birds, like we're thinking about like how big is their mouth to eat these persimmons. And so they're not just, I mean, turkeys are probably the exception in terms of things, birds with, you know, birds in this scenario, where I have seen them consume a whole persimmon. However, most of these birds are pecking, chickens included, are pecking at the flesh once it's fallen, and you know, just eating the flesh through pecks. They are not consuming the seeds. And also, you know, of the mammals, that all of these mammals, deer, raccoon, fox, black bear, coyote, wolf, skunk, squirrel, they all consume well, maybe not squirrel, but all of these consume the fruit with the seed. Or sorry, you would think all of these consume the fruit with the seed. However, deer are sneaky in that they actually spit the seed out. I've seen this on a game camera where they're eating the persimmons off the ground, and then you see the seed just spitting out of their mouth. But raccoon, and so I'm going to get into a little bit of fecal dispersion right now, and just telling you that raccoons, they all poop in like communal systems, latrines. So it's all together. For example, foxes like to go on a promontory, so a higher point, like a log or the crown of a road or such. And so then there's black bear, coyote, wolf, and skunk, that, you know, usually we think are the dispersers of persimmon seed. However, it's not necessarily the case. Other things that eat that eat persimmons are turtles and possums. Possums are quite popular in a lot of like persimmon folklore, where they're even called possum trees. A lot of the time you often see possums up in trees, up in persimmon trees. And so they quite enjoy it. However, they don't move very fast. And so we'll get into this. So there's an issue here with persimmon dispersal. And that's because it's thought that persimmons are like a horticultural anachronism, where like megafauna were the primary seed dispersers in the Pleistocene era. And so these are some of the megafauna thought to eat persimmons and disperse them. And so today we do have, it's interesting in that there is a bit of a lack in what is dispersing the seed, because we've lost them in an ice age, essentially. And so the main persimmon dispersers today, at least in some of the, like at least in Virginia and into some of the a little bit more of the warmer persimmon climates, or maybe the more moderate climates where persimmons are growing, are black bear, which can consume a huge amount of persimmons and cover a lot of ground, and the eastern box turtle, which can consume a tiny amount of persimmons and not cover a lot of ground. And just to give you an idea, this is an actual like graph of the eastern box turtles. You know, this is like back in the day when they would analyze guts of who knows how many turtles and who knows how many other animals at various points of the year, and plot out, you know, what they saw. And so here you go, starting in August, peaking in September, and ending October. The #1 diet of an eastern box turtle is the persimmon. So this, you know, they don't go very far, but I'd imagine that, the dispersal of a seed, like some of these persimmons can have like 8 seeds in them. And so you just think 8 seeds every, gosh, I don't know, 100 feet or so. And so just keep this in mind. Dispersal, I'm getting somewhere with this dispersal. I'm not just telling you about wildlife pooping habits for fun here. All right, so here we go. The Laurentide ice sheet is thought to be one of the main reasons for basically one of the main blocks for persimmon growing regions. Like before this, like a long time ago, there were persimmons growing up in Canada, even in Greenland. Persimmons were growing everywhere. The ice age happened. Laurentide ice sheet is down here. And so what was underneath this Laurentide ice sheet or below it, geographically speaking, is the southern persimmon, which we know has 60 chromosomes. And so that's a tetraploid. So it's got 4 sets of chromosomes. And so this will come in handy later. But for right now, all you need to know is that there's a southern persimmon population that we think very likely covers this map that I've highlighted here. But we'll get there. I'll get there in a little bit. And the southern persimmon, we think, is the taller one. It's not so cold hardy. It has smaller leaves, smaller fruits. The fruits are a bit more seedy because there's less fruit to seed ratio, and they're ripe later. Like generally speaking, sure, you'll find some in September as well, but they're generally ripe in October and into January. The later in the season, they'll tend to dry on the tree and then drop off. All right, but then when that ice sheet started to retreat, the Laurentide ice sheet, we start to see a new type of persimmon, which is the northern persimmon, what we call the northern persimmon right now, which has 90 chromosomes. And so that's called a hexaploid in what I don't know how, I guess I'll just refer to these as 60 chromosome and 90 chromosome from here on out. But in the work we do, it's a hexaploid. And yeah, this is just something that, by the way, like not a ton of plants have this weird ploidy, like, a lot, for example, apples are diploid, having two sets of chromosomes. And a lot of things are diploid. But here we go, we have hexaploid, we have tetraploid. So it's getting a little crazy. 90 chromosome persimmons are we think the shorter ones. They have larger leaves, the fruit is larger, they're ripe earlier, often before frost, and they can be more cold hardy. And there are some examples of seedless fruits of the 90 chromosome northern persimmon. With that said, there are some examples also of the 60 chromosome southern persimmon, and I'll get to that in just a sec. Okay, so this is something that we're working on with Missouri Botanical Garden, is that we don't know, we're calling them races for right now. That's not going to stick. I don't know of a better way to quickly categorize 90 chromosome and 60 chromosome, but the basis of this is there's been 2 works of study on this that have been published. One by Baldwin and Culp in 1941, and 2 by Kentucky State University in 2021, where they didn't do anything to the map except for change Kentucky. And so what this map shows is this hash mark, the X's basically, is hexaploid. So that's the 90 chromosome persimmon, also thought to be the northern persimmon, which is in, Texas and Louisiana and Mississippi and all throughout the Midwest, in Ohio and Pennsylvania. And then there's, this hash persimmon, that's the tetraploid, so the southern persimmon. And then we have these gray ones, that is where both tetraploid and hexaploid persimmon are around. Okay, so one, this map, I have to say, like, this map is super frustrating in various ways, and that's because in the original Baldwin and Culp study, they literally went to 3 places in each state and then they would collect leaves off of the trees, and they would count the number of chromosomes using an old school method of looking under a microscope and dyeing various things, and uh, something that we don't do anymore. We do still to this day, but it's very time consuming and there's very few people still trained in it. Okay, so they went to 3 places in these huge states and then decided, okay, well, that's what it is. Except for in 2021, when Kentucky State University didn't leave the state of Kentucky and looked at what was there and found that, oh, it contains both the tetraploid and the hexaploid. What's not mentioned here is, Indiana and Illinois, which are thought to be some of the greatest persimmon states in the Midwest. And Alabama here is missing as well. And so, hold on, let me see here. Let me go back here. And so let me point out something real quick, is that here, I mentioned, like, in the southern persimmon range, at the very northern tip of that is Alton, Illinois, which is like the southernmost part of the Laurentide ice sheet, and it's retreating. When that ice sheet retreated, that's the exact point where the 90 chromosome persimmon, or the northern persimmon, we think emerged. We don't know. You might ask, like, what's the difference between the 90 chromosome persimmon and the 60 chromosome persimmon, from a genetic standpoint? And we've actually we just sequenced the 90 chromosome northern persimmon. The cultivar we sequenced was Early Golden, which was the first named cultivar that came out of Alton, Illinois. And it's interesting because also the 90 chromosome persimmons have both some of them have male and female flowers on the same tree. And so they're monoecious. They're able to be, they're potentially able to fertilize one another, or each itself. And so anyway, thinking about this is sort of the epicenter of the northern persimmon range. And so this is the range. Yet that map by Baldwin and Culp is showing that this northern persimmon is in Georgia, and then the Kentucky map is showing it's in Kentucky. And so one has to wonder, like, how did it get there? How did the hexaploid persimmon, how did it get into Georgia when it's landlocked by southern persimmons here? And so the question for me then was, I started to zoom out a bit, and I started to think, okay, of course, to me, if we know that box turtles are like the second biggest disperser of persimmon seed, which is ridiculous, we know that box turtles didn't do it. That didn't travel from, Illinois to Georgia, and get get the persimmon there, get the northern persimmon there. And the chances of black bear are high, I guess, but still, like, depending on a black bear species, to get persimmons like the northern persimmons all over the place. And by the way, like, this map is wrong. There's both in Virginia, there's both in North Carolina, there's very likely both in South Carolina. And so the question is, okay, well, what did? And the biggest answer for us at the moment is, well, looking at all those Mississippian mounds that they uncovered and saw all the persimmon seeds, it's very likely indigenous selection and spread that spread the northern 90 chromosome persimmon down through from the southern tip of Illinois all the way into Georgia. And with that said, let me go back to this slide here, all the way up. With that said, when I said Bartram and DeSoto, Bartram had found a a persimmon orchard that was in Georgia, and it was maintained by the Creek Indians, and they had, and one of the major things he had exclaimed was, the fruit size is so large. It's really amazing. Like it's almost like it was it's been cultivated for markets or such. And so when we think of this, what we know so far is that generally the 90 chromosome northern persimmon has a much larger fruit than the 60 chromosome southern persimmon. And so and we know that Georgia, the state that Bartram found, noticed these persimmon orchards, has both northern and southern persimmon in it. So that's the big thing, is like, okay, well, it's obvious then that to us that indigenous spread of persimmon took the northern persimmon all the way down into Georgia. And so that's where I started to dig a little bit deeper into the folklore of it. So, like I said, I'm from Virginia, but one thing, when you start to learn about persimmons and you start to look at like their business plans, kind of. And by business plans, if every year like considering growing a tree crop for monetary value in some way, you want to look at what are their markets, where can you sell these, and so persimmon you often don't see at fresh markets, in fresh stalls. And so where do you see them? And so in the Midwest, there's a dying tradition, I would say, of persimmon puddings, and making a persimmon pudding around the holidays, like around Thanksgiving or so. And that's honestly seems to be, at this point in time, the biggest market for persimmon pulp is sold for usually older people to buy and make persimmon pudding. And this, on this picture right here, is persimmon pudding. I did not grow up with persimmon pudding. It is not part of my cultural heritage in any way. And I grew up in coastal Virginia. And so and if you were wondering what it is, it's it is like a steam pudding in a way. It's also sort of like a really wet brownie with no chocolate in it whatsoever. And it's made completely differently depending on where you are, and usually there's as much sugar to as much persimmon added together, which is insane because persimmons have 31% sugar. But anyway, what I started to see, and that's a thing. So that like there's persimmon pudding, there's pulp being sold throughout Indiana, for example, and online from Indiana. There's pulp being sold for persimmon pudding. So I started to think, okay, well, does persimmon pudding, since we know that Indiana and Illinois, where there's persimmon pudding culture, we know that that's like basically the epicenter of the 90 chromosome persimmon. And so where else can we look, if we look at other places in the United States with persimmon pudding in their culture, and by in their culture, I mean like, if you go to a potluck at a church and in late November, you might find it. That's what I'm talking about. And so if we start looking at it elsewhere, will that show us where the 90 chromosome persimmon was taken by indigenous people? And so I started to look, and I was looking, since I'm in Virginia and I'm often in North Carolina, I started to look at where was this persimmon. I started to notice that there's a persimmon pudding belt in North Carolina. And I sought this out, by the way. Like, you hear it, like Georgianne Eubanks, who's a foodie in North Carolina, she writes about the persimmon pudding belt just briefly. And so I started to look into this a bit. And the persimmon pudding belt follows basically Interstate 85 throughout North Carolina. where, in Hillsborough and Greensboro and, this whole corridor is where you'll start to find, well, and you have to search it out truly, but is where you start to find people who have persimmon pudding culture. And so what I did here was when I was in North Carolina last month, I had contacted one of those old journalists who like runs like kind of like a grumpy gardener type journalist that has a weekly newspaper column. And I contacted him to say, like, because I knew he had written a couple articles on persimmon pudding and various recipes and local people who eat it and who make it and all sorts of things. And I asked him to put out a call for me to anybody who might be willing to lead me to, one, anybody who makes persimmon pudding, but also goes to knows which trees they harvest the persimmons themselves. And if they would be willing to take me to those trees in order to take a look at them, basically. And I lucked out. And so certainly, sure enough, I have people, all around this corridor here. I stopped about there on the map, and I had all these people, all of which were over the age of 65. You know, some shared persimmon pudding with us, but others just took us to the trees and talked about what they did with them and how it's part of, how their grandmothers harvested from this tree and such and such. Okay, so the thing about this I-85 corridor is, yes, it's formerly called the Okinichi or the Trading Path, which goes from, well, it goes all over the place, but this is this is the main route here in red, which goes all the way into North Georgia. North Georgia being very close, this old path that I had to crop, unfortunately for this, but this old path goes North Georgia, very close to the Creek tribe, where Bartram, saw these large persimmon orchards being grown way, way back. And, this path is also largely Interstate 85 as well, going through Charlotte and down. And so what I decided to do, here's the deal, is that back in the day, remember when I said, like, with this annoying map, like they only went to 3 trees and they looked at the leaves underneath the microscope and decided, like, and they counted the chromosomes. Well, today that is vastly different in that we can ship dried leaves of the trees to somebody with a lab and they perform this thing called flow cytometry, which weighs basically, like, is able to weigh the chromosomes and quickly and cheaply determine whether something is a diploid or a tetraploid or even a hexaploid. And so for me and our team here, in trying to understand, like, this indigenous spread of persimmon, I went along this route in North Carolina and collected a lot of seed, and I collected a lot of scion from these trees, the scion of which I'll force into growth, into leaf out, and I'll collect those leaves and I'll send them into the lab, but also, we'll sprout the seeds and we'll do that and send that and sprout the leaves off of those seeds into the lab. And that will tell us, is the persimmon pudding belt, which is honestly, like, in the rest of North Carolina, is like all the south to the east here is southern persimmon. As far as I know, it's 60 chromosome persimmon. So this line here would be the outlier. If this is 90 chromosome persimmon, then that will be some of the first research, especially in persimmon, into indigenous selection and spread, because we know this comes from Alton, Illinois, from southern Illinois. Now, why do we care about this? Why do we care about tracking the pathway of northern persimmon through southern persimmon territories in the South? And the answer to that is there's been very few persimmon breeders in the United States, American persimmon breeders. So truly, like, you know, truly, it's been maybe 60 years of American persimmon breeding, and then after that, a lot of cultivars that are still grafted today and used for these breeding programs were wild selections. So the way this worked was like, you know, in the early 1900s, there were guys who were really into persimmons, and they looked all over the place, especially in the Midwest. They were looking all over the place, and finding these persimmons that were good, that were larger. For example, there's one that comes out of that actually came out of Iowa. That's called the Kansas. I mentioned it earlier. That one was grafted heavily by J. Russell Smith, and I believe I found that in Virginia recently. But you know, that's one that was used that you know was grafted and sold by nurseries all over the place. But there's a lot of other persimmons. Early Golden, which was the first monoecious persimmon to be found and thought to be the oldest named cultivar. You know, that one's grafted too. There's a lot of persimmons that are grafted that are completely wild found. And so in that, with our breeding program with persimmon, we have a lot of parents that don't, you know, that either are directly their parent, a lot of parents that are either these persimmon cultivars that are wild found, or are just basically descendants of these persimmon cultivars that are wild found, and not by maybe like by one or two generations, not by much. And so the thought here is, okay, well, when you're working with a fruit that is essentially novel and hardly domesticated, hardly, you know, it's really important to start carrying with you the idea of who, of paying some sort of, you know, attribution and respect, and giving a lot of credit to those that came before us that worked with these these fruits and these nuts and their selection processes, in order to, you know, when you're beginning a breeding program, you want to carry that forward, and you want to, that's got to be part of the story is, yes, you know, so this persimmon was selected in Southern Illinois, which was selected, you know, last selection was made by Indigenous people. And so, you know, when we think about in breeding, like making crosses and what the future lineage could look like, and if there's a really amazing cultivar that comes out and it needs to be protected, you know, who gets, essentially, who do we then give thanks and potentially royalties to, for their work before us? And so that's why we're very interested in working on tracking the Indigenous spread and selection of persimmon, and because this is actually giving that a scientific backing, which you often don't see. You know, we often, like, there's head butting that happens a lot with traditional ecological knowledge and science, and this is one of those where we're able to more so thread the needle and perhaps get, you know, get the story, get the selection and the spread, but also document it, publish it, and, you know, have real hard evidence about it. And so, yeah, that's where we're going with this persimmon breeding program. I will mention, by back in further up in this presentation here. Let me see here. Hold on. Anyway, I had mentioned that there's northern persimmon cultivars that are seedless and southern persimmon cultivars that are seedless. And that's because we don't exactly know how this works. We don't know how a lot of persimmon stuff works. You know, like I said, only basically 3 people have bred persimmon for the most part, and in like American history, and, you know, we just don't know they've never been really adopted by a university. Like they're just super orphan. But the thought there is that the 90 chromosome persimmon we know cannot pollinize the 60 chromosome persimmon, and vice versa. They do not cross. And so this idea of, okay, well, there's distinct regions essentially, and within those regions, if the 90 chromosome persimmon is in the southern 60 chromosome persimmon range, oftentimes if that 90 chromosome persimmon is there, you know, maybe it's like flowers get tickled a little bit to produce fruit. However, it's seedless because it's not actually getting fertilized. So it's just getting tricked to produce fruit. But it's ultimately, you know, not going to do, you're not going to be any good except for, you know, us humans who really enjoy seedless fruit. And so that's also something to think about in the future in our breeding program is, you know, how seedlessness is a desirable trait. And so trying to understand more of how that works is part of the game that we're playing. And let's see here. Yeah, and so this photo here is of a volunteer that I had. He's a forester turned retired urban forester who whose wife makes persimmon pudding every year, and his wife really shared with me her meticulous recipe for persimmon. But he's collecting scion here, and this was the tree. We went, my selection criteria for trees along this North Carolina persimmon pudding belt, where they had to be a certain height and a certain diameter, because what we're looking for here is, you know, sites that were former farms, that, you know, then of course, like houses popped up and grew everywhere. And so just to recap a little bit, like the most famous 90 chromosome persimmon is called the early golden. It won the World's Fair for best fruit and sort of became the shining star of Southern Illinois. And yeah, it has male and female flowers, and yeah, it's really one of the major parents of most persimmon cultivars that we know of today that have been through a breeding program, or at least a lackadaisical breeding program of crossing naturally. And yeah, like I said, today's persimmons are, most of them you'll see are there. Also, there's some mysteries here where the late great Jerry Lehman, a persimmon breeder, was in contact with a professor at UC Davis who we cannot find by the name he said was his name. I've looked and looked and called, but they said that some of the American persimmons share alleles with Diospyros khaki, which begs the question, what's the difference between the northern persimmon and the southern persimmon? You know, how did the northern persimmon come about? And what we found by so far, we don't have any exact answers, but what we found by sequencing the 90 chromosome persimmon is that it likely came out, you know, it is related to the southern 60 chromosome persimmon, but we don't know if it was a mutation or if it crossed with a now long gone extinct persimmon species that, you know, maybe died with the retreating of the ice sheet or something. So we don't know, but we will find out. There is money now to sequence the 60 chromosome Southern American persimmon. And so that will help start to tell the tale as well of trying to figure out, like, how in the heck did this even happen in the first place for the spread to happen. All right, and that's the end of my presentation for today. But we have a special video talking about persimmon pudding and Mitchell, Indiana, the I guess assumed persimmon capital of Indiana, to share with you. And then I think we can open it up for questions and conversation.
So here we are at the Mitchell Persimmon Festival in Mitchell, Indiana. Traditionally was a celebration of persimmon.
The Persimmon Festival was started back in 1947 by the man named George Bishop, and he decided that he wanted to honor the lowly persimmon. Very small at the time, it was only 3 days. Now we're 8 days long, and we've added many, many more events than what it started with back in 47. The persimmon pudding contest and novelties, and also the parade, and of course the queen contest.
Persimmons are all over Indiana and Illinois and Kentucky. The festival came about for people to collect the best persimmons throughout the Midwest and especially Indiana. And people would bring these persimmons to this festival for judging. This became the sorting ground for the most important cultivars of American persimmon that are still some of the best ones today. And so a lot of the old orchards of persimmons that were being grown in the United States were selections of the Mitchell Persimmon Festival because it started to become known as the best of the best.
So what made you want to come to this festival?
Just persimmons. Persimmon pudding.
I have 3 persimmon puddings.
I'm waiting to hear who the winners are for the persimmon pudding and for the novelty contest.
Pudding contest started back when the festival was founded. It has grown over the years. It's a 4x4 piece of pudding. You have to have it on a white paper plate. Information is on the bottom of the plate to tell who you are.
My grandkids always look forward to it, and their kids look forward to it. And I look forward to it, and I'm 80 years old, and I've missed 2. Each year gets a little bit sweeter and a little bit brighter because you can see the little ones that you had are now married and got little ones of their own, and they're entering it. So it's just kind of like a family tradition. Colors, K.E.
Well, I've entered it. This is my 40th year. And the only thing I ever got was an honorable mention. I got an orange ribbon and a $5 check, and I never cashed the check. It's in a frame with the ribbon hanging on the wall in my home.
Is this your lucky year?
I don't know. We'll see.
Well, first of all, it's got to have a look to it. It can't be too cakey. It has to be a nice, even color. You know, we all like our persimmons because we've been here all our lives, basically. Yeah. And it's a taste like no other.
76 is the second.
If you win, you do have to share your recipe. So, you know, people say, oh, I've got the secret. Well, we've got to know that secret.
If you look into old books like the Northern Nut Growers Association, just hundreds of recipes of how to mix persimmons into different goods, and a lot of that happened here or was made popular here at the Mitchell Persimmon Festival.
You look at the winners and you'll see repeat names. They probably have a special tree that they get their persimmons from. And if they know that tree and that pudding is a winner, that pulp is very good pulp. Those folks do not share where they pick up their persimmons. So it's kind of a little hidden secret sometimes.
Okay, so let's start with that name.
All of you that enter the contest, novelty or pudding, even if you didn't win, you took the time, you took your ingredients, you took your gas, you took your electricity, and especially you took your talent, and you had to go get your persimmon pulp. And this year, we got something that has never ever happened. Our novelty contest, first place was Dan Grissom. Yeah! Yeah! Second place was Dan Grissom. Yeah!
Today I won the novelty and I got so second place in the pudding. Oh my God, I'm so excited. And I kept entering every year, because it's tradition and it's Mitchell. And it's what makes Mitchell special. But I did tell the winner I'm coming after next year.
And so persimmons are still very much part of the local culture here, and strictly also because they're just here everywhere, because persimmon just grows very well in southern Indiana. It might be the best place to grow persimmons in the United States, and so that's alive and well here today.
All right, so let's open this up, I guess, to questions, and
Yeah,
maybe there was
so
some in the chat.
there's a lot of action in the chat, and we've been pulling out a few questions that haven't already received answers. I should say we're about 1 minute from the formal end of this session, but as I said, we don't need to shut this down, so if you've got time, feel free to hang out. So the first question for you, Eliza, is, in your opinion, how much potential is there for persimmon as a crop for people? Can the epicenter for persimmon pudding expand to other regions? Is this something SI is exploring?
Yeah, I mean, with the potential of persimmons as a crop for people comes the need for further domestication, and primarily that's in understanding astringency a little bit more with them. They're getting there with khaki, which is amazing. And since Diospyros khaki is a 90 chromosome persimmon as well, we're hoping that there's going to be some major similarities in that way with, well, at least in the genes with the American Northern persimmon. And so if we can understand if we can start to find the markers associated with astringency in the American persimmon, we can start to select at a very early age and quickly select out those that have these, markers for astringency, and leaning towards the ones that don't, with hopes that, yeah, we can have lots of persimmons where people aren't afraid to try them because they're afraid that their mouth will dry out. Or as Darren reminded me, they'll get persimmon bezoars, which if you don't know what that is, you should look it up.
All right. So we have a question here that may or may not be easy to answer. It's also already received a partial answer in the chat, but I'll toss it out there for your 2 cents. Question is, I live in southern central Kansas on the high plains. What varieties would grow best here? Hardiness zone 6B, loam clay soils, windy, variable moisture, 25 inches per year.
Yeah, I mean,
What do you think?
At 6B, you have a lot more options than 4B. However, it's important to, persimmons don't like a ton of wind, a ton of cold wind. So even if you're like pushing a colder zone, 6B isn't even that cold of a zone, but it's good. Think about like windbreak, then a persimmon line. And honestly, at 6B, you can grow pretty much every cultivar that's out there. One of the best ones is Proc, which is quite large and a lot of flesh, not so much seed. And the flavor is milder, but it probably has the most commercial potential out there.
Great. Yeah, so we got a lot of questions actually coming in now. So here's a good one. If you put a bag over persimmon flower, will they produce fruit? And i.e., I think the question is meant to say, are they parthenocarpic?
Yeah, so some persimmons are definitely parthenocarpic, others are not. That's something that we have a lot of work to do in understanding more of. But yeah, so some that is the case, others that is not. And I wish I could get more specific with you, but I cannot.
Yeah, complicated topic. Here's a good one. Are you, I guess, with your SI hat on or your other hats on, seeking genetic samples for analysis from around the country?
It just depends where you are. The answer is yes. Reach out to us by email if you're wanting to submit some. But yeah, we're going, like, I know Missouri Botanical Garden, by the way, is like, you know, I've just been sampling along the persimmon pudding path, you know, pudding route in North Carolina, but the Missouri Botanical Garden is sampling much, much further. And so also we can help get you in contact with them if you want. Also, by the way, like, if anybody wants to volunteer in sampling persimmons that are randomly selected on a map for whether they're 60 or 90 chromosome, that will be a possibility in the near future.
Great. Are there any competitions to develop other kinds of food products from persimmon?
No, but that's a great one. If you live near Southern Indiana, I can tell you that the Persimmon Festival in is really lacking some leadership in this way and also hungry for it. So if you would like to spearhead this sort of contest for the Mitchell Persimmon Festival, it would be welcome, and I would happily nominate you to the committee.
All right. Next one. Sorry, I got distracted. The image of a bazaar. How much crossing exists with cocky? And I assume this is basically like, you know, interspecific hybridization of Virginiana with, let's say, cocky or other species.
None naturally. So this was done by J.C. McDaniels back in the day at University of Illinois Champaign, Urbana, or Urbana. I don't know how you say it. And he found that they do not hybridize naturally. So like the idea that alleles had been found in khaki alleles had been found in American persimmon is really something. But there's quite a bit that's been done in the Ukraine, Russia, maybe let's just keep calling it the Ukraine, and also over in like Japan, there's been some hybridization done, and that's done sort of in a laboratory through embryo rescue. And so it's not natural.
All right. Moving down the list. Can you use astringent persimmon for making hard cider?
Yeah, you can. They've found that a certain amount of ethanol disperses the tannins out of persimmon, or like makes them go away in some way. You know, I wouldn't juice green persimmons. You know, you'll end up with a tannic juice at the end of it. But ones that are starting to turn, ones that appear ripe, are a lot safer to work with. And it's delicious, by the way. Making alcohol out of persimmons is really great. You need no sugar. It goes like crazy. It's good.
All right.